Good afternoon, everyone. I am honored to address IRE on a topic of importance to us all, especially considering that this is an organization that has long stood up for investigative reporting on the border. Most memorably, after Dan Bowles, an IRE co-founder, was killed by organized crime in Arizona. As you know, in 2006, President Felipe Calderón launched the war on drugs, in part with funding from the United States. Our country became a battlefield. He put soldiers and federal police on the streets, supposedly to fight drug cartels, giving rise to an irregular war which has cost at least 70,000 victims of homicide and more than 20,000 disappeared people. These are unresolved crimes of which we still have not fully grasped the nature. Journalists in many regions of the country have become trapped in the middle of the violence, and due to the lack of investigations into the murders by the authorities, it is still difficult to understand who is truly behind the crimes. We, Mexican journalists, have become war reporters in our own country. In my case, for example, I began as a reporter who covered poverty, who from one day to the next was suddenly covering massacres of young people, documenting ghost towns abandoned after a series of murders, or social programs for children orphaned by the violence. One day, I had in front of me a row of 30 women with photos of their missing children who wanted to tell me their stories. I have dedicated much of my own work as an investigative reporter at Proceso to ferreting out the truth behind many of these episodes and documenting the victims of the war. The journalists, we were not prepared for the violence. Suddenly, there we were being pushed around in the chaos in the middle of a war which was not about drug trafficking, as they told us, but for control of territory, a war to see who will hold onto the land where narcotics are grown, the trafficking routes, and the points of sales of drugs in the country, to see who will control the business, who will tax the sellers, who will appoint the mayor or the chief of the police. And in a situation like this, it is clearly central to have control of the press, so that no one asks questions, to guarantee control of the population. I and other reporters founded an organization called Periodistas de a pie, Journalists on Foot, to train journalists who cover poverty. However, we have to change focus quickly to respond to the crisis. We held workshops on how to survive on assignment, how to understand the drug trafficker, how to interview a child who has survived a massacre, how to continue reporting without losing the joy of living, or encrypt our communications. Before we realized, we were a crisis center. At any hour of the day, including these the deadlines moments, we have received calls from colleagues in remote zones desperately seeking help because they know the hitmen are coming for them and they need refuge, or requests for psychological support for reporters who don't want to go back out to work after a traumatic event like a fire or attack on their office. In this war for territory, the journalists have become victims because unlike in traditional wars, In Mexico, journalists don't die in the crossfire from a stray bullet, from walking in minefields. In Mexico, the killers hunt down journalists, dragging them out of their offices and their houses, or intercepting them in the streets. In Mexico, the reporters who are supposed to fill the news became ourselves the news. In the last 10 years, at least 17 journalists have disappeared and 72 have been killed. No one of them have been solved. One of them is Regina Martinez, the valiant reporter who exposed corruption and organized crime in Veracruz. She worked for Proceso magazine, as do I. A year ago, she was strangled in her house. The local government, which may be implicated in the murder, decided without evidence that her murder was the result of a robbery. As in the other murders of journalists, the judicial authorities did not consider her journalistic work as a possible cause of the murder. As in the other murders, they blamed the journalist for her own death and tried to call her integrity into question. After her murder, 2 more journalists were killed, with another who had recently left the profession out of fear. These killings had the desired effect in the state of Veracruz. They silenced the rest. At least 17 journalists fled the state, some of them paid by the state government to leave and come back after the elections. Some left the profession in an attempt to save their lives. Others of them are cutting grass or selling tacos in the United States, or rely on solidarity to sustain themselves, whilst they wait for their asylum cause to be heard. Others work as street vendors or as whatever they can in Mexico City, trying to rebuild their lives, terrified, penniless, broken. The situation is different in various regions of Mexico. In some areas, drug traffickers leave videos or messages, and they call up the journalists to report on them. In other zones, the warnings always come accompanied by violence, and journalists who publish information that annoys a certain group are abducted and tortured and their skin marked to show that they won't get a second chance. In some areas, journalists are forced to attend press conferences by the local cartel chief, who dictates the editorial line, telling them what information to cover and what to ignore. Generally, they give them the instructions to follow, they watch them, and they pay them a salary. The newsrooms are infiltrated too. Whoever refuses has to change job or start a new life somewhere else. In places like Mexico City, they are visited by the so-called narco lawyers, who tell them which information irritated their clients. In this turf war, the media is a target. They receive intimidating phone calls, bombs are hurled, they are fired upon with heavy arms. There have been cases in which employees, and not always journalists, have been taken as hostage to force the publication of something. Some newsrooms have been burned down as reporters are inside writing. Some states have become zones of silence, and the silence have extended. We are losing contact with regions that are now forbidden territory for everyone. in which no longer know something as basic as how many people are killed every day. Only from time to time, when a massacre occurs and is so spectacular that it can't be covered up, such as that of 72 migrants, only in that case we get a sense of what is happening. Only then can we get an idea of what is being hidden. One of the most dangerous states for journalists is only 265 kilometers from here, less than 3 hours on the highway, on the other side of the border, where silence has been imposed. The states like Tamaulipas, where many blood-chilling episodes take place. For example, for months, passengers in public buses have been made to get off and in that very place recruited by force, taken as slaves, or killed and buried. Only suitcases arrive at bus terminals. Nobody said anything until graves were found containing almost 200 bodies. In places like this, and in various parts of the borderland, people disappear along with their car or truck. Some were Mexicans on their way to McAllen or Laredo to go shopping or to visit, and some were Americans visiting relatives in Mexico. I remember when I went to Matamoros, across the border from Brownsville, to cover the discovery of this mass grave. It was said that there were thousands of bodies, but they didn't finish excavating it. Hundreds of anguished families arrived there from all over the country, all looking for a child who had disappeared. A woman who was waiting to see if one of these bodies was that of her son found out I was a journalist, and she began to hold forth furiously. Why are you, reporters, coming here now, she said. For months, we have been saying that people were disappearing on this highway, but nobody paid any attention. It felt like we were talking from the bottom of the sea. Her phrase, talking from the bottom of the sea, sums up perfectly the situation that this lost zone is living. There, where the Dallas Morning News reported that 8 journalists had disappeared, something that we Mexicans didn't know, and that there are training camps for the sicario, the hitmen, some of them teenagers from Laredo, Texas. In this area full of hidden graves, sown with corpses, citizens are murdered every day. Even the border crossing is controlled by drug traffickers who abduct those who don't pay and decide who goes through and who dies. Many journalists try to speak out about it until they were silenced. As far as they can, they are still trying. How much they can do depends on where they live. In desperation, citizens have tried to assume the role of the journalist. I remember that video filmed by a normal citizen who went out into the streets to record on her cell phone the destruction of the battle of the night before, of the shootouts that the authorities claim don't happen. They use social networks or set up blogs such as Valor por Tamaulipas, where they post citizens' reports of armed encounters, which the media are prohibited from covering. These websites don't last long. The drug cartels put a price on the heads of their administrators. The government is also interested in shutting down these sources of information because it contradicts the official government position that everything is well. I know a journalist who went to Tamaulipas to report on the situation in the main square in front of the government building. He was surrounded by a convoy of vans which bore the logo of the local cartel on their number plates. The reporter and the cameraman were abducted and tortured and warned to stop asking questions. In this area, the earth swallowed a young freelance visitor from San Antonio who left his hotel to take photographs and never came back. And a Mexican reporter who anonymously ran a blog for citizens telling them where there were shootouts and publishing their complaints was decapitated, and her body found with a note threatening anyone who uses social networks. The violence has even reached Mexico City. An example is the magazine where I work, which was founded 4 decades ago and is still considered a leader in investigative journalism today. Proceso is one of the media which has suffered aggressions. Not only did they murder Regina Martinez, 4 journalists have been forced to move outside the country or one city to another, and just this year, 4 have been threatened. And Proceso is not the worst case. Other exists. With this panorama, from being active journalists without quite knowing how, we became defenders of human rights. And in Periodistas de a Pie, we have organized marches to demand an end to impunity and justice for our colleagues, as well as collections to support journalists who have had to flee their homes. And we support other local journalists, helping them become stronger, organize themselves, and develop their own techniques to deal with emergencies. We don't agree that the only way for the government and some international organizations to deal with this crisis is by removing journalists from their home territory, because in this way, the silencers win the game. The battle we have is not only for freedom of expression, it's for people's right to be informed. In many areas, the watchdog is chained, muzzled. It does not have permission to bark. It is an abused animal who has learned not to bark when an enemy approaches. It is a dog domesticated by governors who vowed its silence. It is a dog forced to turn a blind eye to violations of the law. However, even in some of the worst places, there are a few fierce and isolated watchdogs still fighting to defend the owners of the house they protect, still resisting the leash. There are isolated individual efforts through heroes who risk their lives with every article they write. Not every part of Mexico has come to this extreme point, but the silence is spreading, not only through violence, but through more sophisticated methods, such as the threats of imprisonment or using advertising propaganda paid by the government. Mexico's newly elected president has insisted to speak well of Mexico. At the moment, politicians and organized crime share the same objective, que no se caliente la plaza, to keep from heating up the areas they control. In a panorama like this, investigative reporting has suffered. Journalists are no longer the watchdogs of democracy. One of these journalists who are the target are the investigative journalists. For example, Ramon Ángeles Salpa, he exposed the extraction of natural resources of mines and forests by organized crime in Michoacán, and he was never seen again. Or Maria Esther Aguilar Casimbe, she published about the capture of a trafficker mayor, a police torturer, and the seeing of a shipment. And any one of these three stories could be the cause of her disappearance. Some live with a pistol to their head. Others live running with only their keys in their pocket to start again until the night covers them. Although we have new laws which allow us to access public information, investigative journalism is become more and more difficult. Even daily journalism is under threat. There are questions that now nobody asks. In 1976, the IRE made a great effort to shed light on the murder of Dan Bowles by traffickers. You were not able to live with this murder. You made great investigative efforts because he was one of your own. On the other side of the border, they are killing journalists like flies. Some of them are young people who dream of being investigative journalists. Others were skilled reporters who died investigating stories. Armando Rodriguez El Choco was a member of the IRE Mexico project and had spoken at its conferences. He was the reporter who counts the daily killings for El Diario de Juárez, and he was killed when he was taking his daughter to school. These are your colleagues, our colleagues, members of our family of investigative reporters. I want to ask you that you don't ignore us. This problem don't stop at the border. Thank you. Great efforts had been made, and many top United States newspapers covered the violence in Juárez, and in fact, almost all the newspapers of the world eventually sent someone there. There are subjects that came to light thanks to the work of US investigative reporters or correspondents, such as Operation Fast and Furious, Rápido y Furioso, which make us so indignant, or the existence of the databases with up to 25,000 names of people who disappeared under the last government. But as time passed, and all these deaths, all these massacres, all these mass graves, all these bodies, all these missing people stopped being so newsworthy. As Lise Olsen wrote in a book, on the US side, reporters who are informed and experienced in Mexico and the border have been dropped in all border states, largely by economic reasons, but the violence has had an impact too. Every major newspaper in the region has cut or entirely eliminated their bureaus. The San Diego Union, Los Angeles Times, the Arizona Republic, the Dallas Morning News, or the Houston Chronicle, and the Express News that, for example, the Houston Chronicle, once had 3 border reporters and 2 in Mexico City, and now just has 1. And many US newspapers no longer allow reporters to cross the border to cover any story. Many times reporters as you ask us, how can we help? We could say raising funds, offering asylum, raising awareness, but what we ask from IRE members is that you do your work here, that you investigate trafficking networks in your own country, that you share this problem, which is mutual. It isn't only gun trafficking that adds to the death toll in our country. It's the corruption of the government officials, it's the US drug dealers and gangs, and US dirty businessmen and money launderers. We don't ask for anything that is not in your best interest, but as your friends, we need you to see that you need to face this problem as your own. Asking yourself, who is my neighbor? Who controls neighboring states? Because we share 3,000 kilometers of border. Because as you have reported, Mexican cartels are present in more than 200 cities and keep growing. Also push for your newspapers to cover stories about how Mexican policy cost lives or forced journalists or others into exile. Many of those who were forced to flee are here, right here in Texas, and are included in the growing list of those who had asked for asylum. I would like to have come here to talk about a different panorama, to tell you how fruitful were the courses and the conference that IRE's Mexico project organized in Mexico City in the 90s, and in the 2 binational meetings in Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez. But what's left after they shut up your office 3 times, as happened to El Siglo de Torreón, even though it had federal protection, or as El Mañana de Nuevo Laredo, they killed 2 editors and throw a bomb which kills and wounds many people. Or El Diario de Juárez, that after 2 of its reporters were murdered, wrote an editorial asking drug lords who control the city what their ground rules were, thereby revealing to the world that the Mexican national government had no control over the largest city on the US border. Very few examples, but there is not an organization dedicated to promoting investigative journalists. The ones that formally exist have had to focus on protection of journalists. And the battle to control information is underway at this very moment. Not everything is lost. Valiant efforts are being made. The magazine Zeta de Tijuana, for example, monthly tells us the correct figures for the killings, because otherwise no one would have access to that state's data. Collaboration sometimes help. Editors who agree to publish the same article when they put pressure on someone from the group, or collaboration between reporters and foreign correspondents so that news prohibited in Mexico can be written elsewhere. Other journalists have created news blogs to inform the people of what is happening, and they maintain them for the time they are able to keep their identity secret. In one case, a few reporters opened a blog in Texas, but ran it from the Mexican side of the border in order to avoid detection until they were discovered. Journalists have also created our own networks, and I know various journalists who are secretly writing a book, hoping that conditions change and they can publish it. These are efforts which go against the current. These are isolated and for their own safety, anonymous heroes among various enemies. Companies which don't protect their own people, the corrupt government, and organized crime. I have a story embedded in my mind. I repeat it sometimes. Perhaps you have already heard it, but I can't avoid retelling it here. A reporter told me how one night someone called to tell him that a commando squad had taken his colleague. He got up from the bed, got dressed, said goodbye to his wife, kissed his children, and sat down in the living room, waiting to be taken away. It was the longest night of his life. Why didn't you run? I asked, surprised. Where could I run? He said. My only wish was to stop them entering my house and taking me in front of my family. I didn't want my family to remember me with that image. He survived, but his friend was found the next day, his body discarded in the street as if he were trash. In the city where they live, the policemen are the narcos. There is another one I can forget. A colleague went to see what help she could give to another reporter. She asked how we could help him, and he said, bring me a pistol. And she was stupefied. A pistol? Yes, he said, it is not to kill them. It's to kill myself if they come for me, because now they don't just kill you, they torture you as well. Whenever I recall these stories, I think of how many journalists could be feeling that same solitude, not knowing whom to ask for help. Too many are resigned to the fact that death is our destiny. So, the question of what we can do acquires a different resonance. You can do many things, but I believe that we must do journalism because that is what we are, journalists. We must expose the business, the drugs, and arms trafficking networks, the corrupt authorities. We must follow up on judgment to piece together the puzzle of where the disappeared people end up. We must follow the narco money on both sides of the border. Again, this is not just about helping us, it's about helping yourselves as well. In an IRE workshops, I learned that reporters from Laredo or McAllen, Texas, have also been threatened not to cross the border, and correspondents, as Alfredo Corchado, for example, was threatened in a bar in Texas. Here, you have a strong institution which still function, as well as access to judicial experience. Help us from here to publish what there we can't even find. A friend in Sinaloa, in the investigative magazine Rio 12, perhaps said the best way, don't abandon us. I say the same to you. As the great Polish writer Richard Kapuczynski once said, in the struggle against silence, human life is at stake. Thank you.